Good morning, friends. I'm Asha Nayaswami, and we're continuing with our fireside chats. When I started these in the middle of March, I had no idea we'd still be going. I naively thought life would go back to what we considered normal, but now the challenge is to live in the now and call whatever is happening normal. And I think it's a very good plan. I'll talk about that a little bit more. Let's say a prayer together. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master, Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to attune our consciousness to your loving presence, to see in whatever you send us the hand of your blessing. Help us to know that we are your children, ever protected and guided by your wisdom. Walk with us, talk with us. Awaken within us an unending consciousness of our divine bliss in thee. Om, peace. Amen. This morning we're continuing our conversation about the gurus of self-realization. And we've reached Paramhansa Yogananda. We talked a bit about him last week, our last session, which happened to be last week since we only do this 4 days a week. And now I just sort of like to go on with it a little bit. When Swami Kriyananda was living with Master would sometimes talk about previous incarnations that he or others among them had. And one of the things that Master told Swamiji and others was that he had been William the Conqueror in a previous lifetime. Now, William the Conqueror lived with the famous Battle of Hastings, I believe, was 1066. And William moved across from the French side, across the Channel, and took over the country of England on the belief that he was the rightful heir to the throne. He didn't do it as an expansionist taking over territory, but in those days, the lines of succession of kings through the right set of heirs and so on like that was considered to be a God-given divine right. And once a king was anointed in the church in a certain way, then the power was not considered to be of man. And that was where the devotion to kings came from, and then devotion to lineage came from. All of those things, of course, over time began to shift, but that was the truth then. The religion and the secular and the religious authorities were completely combined like that. And William also, there he was. He was a God-realized master, an avatar, who had incarnated, and I mean, just even to make it more fun, is the illegitimate son of the Duke of Normandy, and then became this great warrior who literally created the country of England, pulled together the energy of the place. Swamiji said, of course, as a young disciple, he just absolutely had no idea what to think about it. There was so much that happened to him when he first became a disciple. He read Autobiography of a Yogi, and 5 days later was kneeling in front of Master, and Master put his finger on Swami's heart chakra, and he said for about 2 minutes, he held his finger there, and he said Master's hand actually vibrated with the energy that he was putting through him. Swamiji said it wasn't so much that he felt something in the moment. It wasn't like he was transported to other worlds. He said, but from that moment, he was a different man. I mean, the whole scene is really extraordinary when you think of it. Swami's 22. He's gotten on a bus. He's come across the country. He's gone 5 days and 5 nights. He arrives first he arrives in Encinitas trying to find Paramhansa Yogananda, however he called him. I've never even heard the word pronounced. Sister Gyanamata greets him at the door and says, well, Master's not here. He's in Hollywood, which was a couple of hours north. So he's just completely bewildered by all of this. finally finds Master, is first told he can't talk to him. So now he's been chasing him, for a day and a half here, trying to get to Master, finally is sitting in front of him. And in that experience, Master pledges his unconditional love to Swamiji. Now, we all want to feel unconditionally loved by the Master, but Swami believes, and he never made a big point of it, that it was unusual for Master to verbally make that kind of a pledge, especially at the first meeting with the disciple. Who knows? But nonetheless, it was profoundly moving for Swami. And then Master asked of Swami, will you give me your unconditional love? This is their first meeting. And Swami has come there after reading Autobiography of a Yogi, but he's a 22-year-old American in 1948. It wasn't as if everybody he knew was going to India and looking for a guru. That actually came much later, largely because of Autobiography of a Yogi, but it had only been out for 2 years when Swamiji read the book. And he's sitting there in front of Master, and he's becoming, and he was initiated as a monk and a disciple. He's pledged his unconditional obedience and his unconditional love to this man in front of him whom he's just met. Now, for anyone who knew Swamiji or knows him through his writings, you know what an extraordinarily strong-minded individual he was. But the other aspect of Swamiji, which was very interesting, which was he trusted himself. And that also is the characteristic of a very strong-minded person. He was accustomed to believing his own perceptions, which of course is a very powerful, positive quality and an essential quality for a disciple. Because a mindless disciple is not a real disciple. You have to be able to make the teachings your own. So Swami talked about Master after he was initiated, after he pledged his obedience, after Master had asked him a few questions, held his finger on his heart chakra for 2 minutes. And Swami said, in subtle ways, is how he put it, when he stood up, he was a completely different person. So he's living there with Master, trying to absorb just everything he can. And Master died 3.5 years after that first meeting. So before Swami was 26, Master was gone from this world. And Sri Yukteswar had lived well into his 80s. Master was, I believe, 59 years old when he passed away. And there was he hadn't gone through a long period of declining health. Master had hinted a little bit that, in the days or a few months before he actually left his body, but it was actually, I believe, incomprehensible to them that Master's life was about to end. Also, Master veiled that information, veiled his consciousness in that regard. Swamiji thought he was about to go to India with his guru. That was where Swami's mind was, and then all of a sudden, Master breathes his last, and it's over like that. So Swami did not have a lot of time to mature and to work through all of the many things that one does as a disciple. I always, whenever I talk about Master, I end up talking about Swami, because what I know about Master is from knowing Swami. So in my mind, I can't really separate them. So that's just how this will be. But I'm going to go back to William, because that was the thread I was picking it up by. So Swamiji had actually been, he was educated mostly through the English system of education, in which William is not considered a hero. That's why he's called the conqueror, because he conquered England. Although, my knowledge of history is mostly what Swami has told me. England didn't really exist as England until after William pulled it together as a united kingdom. But nonetheless, there's this national pride among the English, and so they felt like William came over from France and conquered them rather than created them. But the many interesting aspects. So Swamiji said first that William, in his historical training, had been more of a villain than a hero. And so all of a sudden, Swami's having to face the fact that the man that had been vilified in his education was actually his own guru. Swamiji talked about many times in those first years, well, all those years, especially in the first months, he said sometimes he would actually stagger with the magnitude of what he was having to do, and he would have to sit down because he would feel almost dizzy as his mind tried to accept these new realities. And William the Conqueror was one of them. Swami subsequently did a lot of historical research and discovered that William the Conqueror was an extraordinary man who went to Mass every day of his life. All of his best friends were saints. In a time when it was universal for a king to have multiple mistresses, he was absolutely faithful to his wife and just had characteristics that were not the characteristics, they were the characteristics of a very high-minded person, which is more likely. In fact, when Master himself heard certain stories that were told about his life with William, he began to laugh and said, "Oh, you said history is a lie agreed upon." That's what people say. He said it just didn't happen anything like that. Swami remarked once, someone starts telling a story and they throw in some amusing little tidbit and it gets a good laugh. So the next time it becomes a little bigger, and by the end it's the central piece of the story. Then the next one repeats it and on it goes. But the other interesting, extremely interesting factor here is, why would an avatar incarnate as a king who went to war a great deal of the time? And Master also said that he had been a Spanish general who had helped drive the Moors out of the Spanish peninsula, just push the Moors out of that country. In other words, and when Master went to England, it was being invaded by Scandinavians who were not Christian, who were pagan, was the word that they would use. And of course, it's common these days. We do a lot of political correcting over time. It's common these days to honor indigenous people. But the fact of the matter is, Sanatan Dharma was represented by Jesus, and even if whatever the Scandinavian worldview was, it was not empowered in the same way that Christianity was. So in two incarnations, both as William and then later as the Spanish king, Master's job was to defend and establish Christianity. And in William's time, Lanfranc, who was an incarnation of Sri Yukteswar, who was first of all a monk and later the archbishop, he revitalized and reformed the Christian monastic movement. And then Rajasi was Lanfranc's successor, and Lanfranc was William's spiritual advisor. Swami was William's son, Henry, and Anselm, who was Rajasi, was Swami's spiritual advisor. And it was all focused around Christianity and the Catholic Church, all of which makes you sort of fall over sideways because it's not the way we think in modern terms. And then later, Swami, not Swami himself, but one of the avid researchers in the Ananda world, tried to understand which Spanish king Master must have been, and it's pretty conclusively that he was Ferdinand III, who was called Ferdinand the Saint, if I'm not mistaken. And he, for 26 years, which was almost his entire adult life, Ferdinand was in the saddle with a sword in his hand doing battle. And he was, once again, he was preserving the Spanish country for the Catholic religion, to keep Jesus as the foremost influence there. And as William, too, he was a warrior the whole time. In fact, Master would talk about certain of his disciples. There was a disciple he had named Jerry, who was a very rough character. Swami described him. He was not educated. He was not particularly refined, but he really loved Master. And Master said about him, he fought hard for me. So it's like, one of the reasons I think that Master would have incarnated to be a general and have a whole lifetime of war is because there were disciples who needed it. Because to be that courageous, to believe in a cause, to have such faith in your leader that you'll literally risk your life or give your life in order to fulfill whatever his command is for you, I mean, on a certain level, that's an extremely high level, both of devotion and courage and detachment and idealism. And so Master, I think, incarnated, this occurred to me recently, he incarnated partly because he had a lot of disciples who needed to be soldiers. Norman Paulson, who was a very big man, Master called him my giant. And he also said, too, that Norman had been a great soldier for him in those lifetimes. I mean, now, Master was not appearing as a guru. He wasn't chanting Om and blessing people at the spiritual eye, but the relationship was there, the power was there, and I'm sure those men who were his soldiers, were willing to die for him and trusted him literally with their lives and more than that. So obviously the relationship was already well established at that time. The power must have been there. So the reason I'm talking, sort of starting talking, and I should add, which probably many of you know, but if you don't, Catherine Kairavi wrote a book at Swami's request about William being master and Swami being Henry I, who was his successor. Not immediately, because he had two older brothers, who had to sort of have their turn before it all ended up in Swami's hands. And she wrote a book called Two Souls, Four Lives, which in itself is a great title. Very, 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 very interesting book. And it's interesting to read about Ferdinand III and Alfonso X. I'm just going to say something about Alfonso X, which is also fun, who was Swami Kriyananda. He was the blood son of Master, again, the biological, not merely the spiritual son. And he was, when Swamiji was Henry, he helped organize, focus, and solidify what William had started. William came and had to create this, and then it was Henry who brought it all into clear and focused, enduring form, who organized it, took the implications of what William had done and stretched them out into solid governing. Henry was the king for 30 plus years, and it was one of the most peaceful and the most prosperous eras in English history when Henry was in charge. And among other things, Henry created laws, many laws, and put England under the rule of law rather than under the whimsy of whoever had the biggest sword at that point, which was a huge shift. So eventually, now, see, excuse me, I'm saying this incorrectly. I'm going to shift over again. I'm going to go back. All of that is true about Henry, but what I really wanted to talk about was Alfonso X in that way. Alfonso played exactly the same role in regard to Ferdinand that Henry had played in regard to William. He took everything that Alfonso had begun, and then he solidified it, codified it, made it more clear. Alfonso was also an astronomer and a musician and a linguist and a poet, just many things that Swami is. And he also created a system of law so that when the Spanish went to America, and this is where I'm going with all of this, when the Spanish went to America, they took the Spanish system of law. And for a long time, the Southwest was governed by the Spanish. And the Spanish system of law was in place there. And when the United States was formed, which of course was later, it was inhabited and divided up among other nations because the US didn't even exist. But when the United States was formed and gradually its laws and edicts were developed, the laws of the Southwest, which were the Spanish laws, which were the laws of Alfonso X, greatly influenced the development of America. So in the House of Representatives, there are apparently, and I think this number is correct, 32 historical portraits, and one of them is Alfonso X, because that was the stream that led to the American. It was influential enough that in tribute, his portrait was put there. Now, what we're working with in all of this is, if in fact, as I believe is true because it's been told to me, that these masters have had all these previous incarnations and have been working with the development of this planet for a very long time, like, where do you cut it? It's a bit like the law of karma itself. Each time they come, they're working on this long vision of time. And the little world that we live in, I mean the material world by that. When I say the little world, I mean, the material world that is little because our perspective is really little. I'm 73 years old now. Just this morning when I was looking for something else, I came upon, there's about, I don't know, 25 or 50 of my videos posted. And the date on the posting is like 2015, but the date of the recording is 1999, which is 21 years ago. And oh, look at that. Same face, same mouth, just going, same teachings 21 years ago. Very different looking person, different era of my life, but just a minute, really, a minute in time. But even then, then as now, working with the vision of what I was doing, what we were doing, where we're going, how we're going to get there, what's going to contribute to it. But my time frame is, teensy. 20 years is like nothing. But what we're doing in this world, as above, so below, as it is on the higher planes. Let me phrase it differently. We get a glimpse of the higher planes by seeing what's going on here. In the same way that we consciously apply our will with either a more or less enlightened idea of where we're going. That's how the masters work. In Autobiography of a Yogi, I started there, where Babaji and Jesus are talking about, or masters saying that they're aware of what's going on and they're planning the salvation of this age. I mean, that's a real long-term commitment, in which one incarnation is really just a blip in time. That was when I asked Swamiji once, after he'd been through a period of very serious health issues, and I went to visit him in Europe. When I first saw him, Swamiji, how are you? How are you feeling? Oh, he said, compared to eternity, compared to an eternity of bliss, he said, all time is short. So if I'm suffering now, what does it matter? So when the masters are working for the gradual evolution of the whole of our society and raising the vibration so that every jiva who incarnates here will be lifted to a higher level, this is a very long process. So the fact that Swami incarnates, when Master incarnates, to create a system of law that makes its way to Texas, that ends up defining America, then Master is born in India and comes to the shores of America. It's sort of like this country had to be made ready. This country had to exist. There had to be some continuous flow of a divine plan that would result in a Dwapara Yuga country being here. Because in order to create a self-realization movement that is fitting for Dwapara Yuga, there had to be a Dwapara Yuga country. And the characteristic of that, interestingly, is exactly in the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." I mean, that's the statement, that's the definition of Sanatana Dharma, these self-evident truths. And Jefferson was a brilliant writer, and he just such a poet. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Now, this document was a revolution. Now we're engaged, literally now in 2020, we're engaged in an effort to expand those words to really apply to all men, because even when they were written, there was a contradiction among the ideals that were expressed, and even Thomas Jefferson himself. But it was like Jefferson wrote more than he was able to live up to. But the destiny of the country was set now, and now it's become, interestingly, incumbent upon us at this time to make those words true. But to finish, endowed by their Creator. So it's not even, this is not a man-made law. This is a self-evident truth that comes from God, that all men are created equal. And men, women of all races, we have to make it true now. All men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, life itself, freedom, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, again, this is Sanatana Dharma. This is the founding document of the country that Master came to launch a spiritual revolution that would bring in Dwapara Yuga. Fascinating, isn't it fascinating? And of course, a great many of the people who came to this country, England was the dominating force. And England, where did England come from? England came from William the Conqueror. And at least my mind goes boing. I just don't know. I don't know how to think about all of this, except I find it helpful in the moment. Because when it's history, you're not on the field of battle scared to death. You're not alone hoping that your husband doesn't die. You're not trying to take care of 4 children when food is scarce and life seems really impossible. You're just reading it afterwards and watching how marvelously the play is written and how all the parts play together. And we are in the middle of the same divine drama, heading in the same divine direction. And our ship is captained by the same avatars that made all of those things happen, that created England. And then England became this extraordinarily dominant force all over the world. England's invasion or taking over of India, which was not laudable in many ways, but interestingly, among other things, it made India an English-speaking country, and when many people were educated in English. And even though there was an attempt by Gandhi, an appropriate attempt, to cut the ties with the colonial government of England, and the dominance and the disrespect and all of the other things that were there, nonetheless, and an attempt to make an indigenous language be the language, nonetheless, English remained the language. And that changed India's relationship to the whole world in the times we live in now. Because Indians were educated in English, they were able to merge with America in a way that other countries have managed, but not with the ease that India has done. Now, Master says that the future of this world is India as the spiritual custodians and America as the practical, efficient materialists. And when those two realities come together, that's when Dwapara Yuga will really find its footing, so to speak. And right now we're just oscillating among all these realities, but we are in the middle of a tremendous revolution. And some of us, many of us, were born for this. We were born whatever role we're going to play, whether we're going to be galloping on a horse behind William holding up a sword, or sitting in front of a camera, just talking and talking and talking, or practicing Kriya in the privacy of our own homes. Well, the reason I'm starting with Ferdinand and William and Thomas Jefferson and all of these things is to help us see this in context and to help us understand, what our masters are trying to accomplish. Because if we're going to be the friends of our gurus, and to be the friend of the guru is a very positive thing to be, or the adult children of our gurus, then we have to understand what they're trying to do if we're going to carry out our Father's work. As Jesus said to his parents when he was 12, and they all went to Jerusalem, and then his parents left, and Jesus just stayed behind. Took them several days to realize he wasn't part of the caravan. Then his parents ran back to the temple to look for him, and they found Jesus just sitting calmly in the temple. And Jesus was quite surprised that his parents were so alarmed. And he said quite simply, "Don't you know I have to be about my Father's business?" And that's us, friends. We have to be about our Father's business. And in order to carry it out well, it behooves us to understand what that business is. So I think we'll be talking about this for several more days. So God bless you, my friends.